Welcome to day number 3, and welcome to India in Situ, Textile History and Practice, a team approach. I'm Barbara Setsu Pickett, and in 20 brief days, the 5 of us immersed ourselves in the glory of Indian textiles. Our names and affiliations are here, and we shall introduce ourselves more after these opening remarks. At the last TSA Symposium, I presented my field research done in 2016 on Rahul Jain's reinvented Indian velvet drawloom. Among the attendees at my talk were Annin Barrett, Bier, and Louise Mackie. There and then, Louise planted the seed for a return trip. Annin is a longtime friend. Carol I knew from her book, The Persian Velvets at Rosenborg, and on our work together on her TSA Toronto session, Textiles plus Math equal Infinity. Louise I hadn't met, but knew from her book, Symbols of Power, and her work at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Louise suggested that Anna Jolie join the group since they had already made preliminary plans for a trip to India. Now, Rahul's quest, started 25 years ago, is to recreate the exquisite Mughal and Iranian textiles of the 17th century, like this spectacular velvet from the Cincinnati Museum of Art. He and his team are bringing back 5 complex weave structures on 5 drawlooms, one dedicated to each historical technique: takate samit, lampas, brocaded double cloth, brocaded weft substituting twill, and velvet. I say reinvented because the historical record lacks continuity, nor are there descriptions of the velvet looms used. Rahul's team adapts the traditional Indian drawloom and builds on the Varanasi weaving tradition to recreate these almost extinct textiles. Our dream trip blossomed when Rahul wrote that he would not only welcome us, but join us in Varanasi and Cholapur. He recommended at least 4 days together. That clinched it for me. I contacted Indigo, the travel agency that specializes in tours featuring artisans at their traditional crafts. They handled all the logistics, including lodging and internal transportation. This trip would not only deepen my understanding of the drawloom, the Naqsha, and the design process, but also be a traveling seminar with 4 eminent textile scholars. Life doesn't get better than this. Each of us will tell what prompted us to join the trip. Then Carol will talk about the connections between textiles and architecture. Louise and Anna will capitalize the historical collections we studied, and I shall elaborate on the drawloom and the Naqsha. And Annin will review the school's exhibitions and current movements. We invite you to submit your questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button. After we have all presented, Carol will direct your questions and handle that session. We've budgeted between 20 and 30 minutes for question and answers. Now Louise Mackie will share her motivations to join the trip.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Louise Mackie. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. So ever since the 1990s, I have wanted to see the drawlooms recreated by Rahul Jain. In his booklet, Minikar, he stated that after setting up a drawloom workshop in New Delhi, the silk weavers succeeded in weaving the compound weaves, but not how to refine the texture, the pattern, and the weight. Next, please. We could not anticipate, and I'm quoting, that it would take some 3 years of continuous development to match the superb physical quality of Mughal Indian on Safavid Iranian work, end quote. And now 25 years later, they're still refining their velvet weaving. Next, please. In 1988, Rahul Jain was an economist working at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He took a weaving workshop and read a Textile Museum Journal article on royal Mughal sashes. They transfixed him and changed his life. Inspired by seeing a royal sash through a microscope at the Textile Museum, thanks to curator Carol Bier, Rahul enrolled in the Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science. In 1993, he set up Asha, a drawloom workshop in New Delhi, now relocated near Varanasi. Next, please. Rahul Jain has many talents. He is an award-winning designer, manufacturer, textile technician, scholar, and author, and a delightful human being. Last year, the National Museum in Delhi celebrated Asha's 25 years of production with 43 of his radiant silks. Rahul Jain inspired all of us and was the catalyst of our sensational collaborative research trip in India. Next, please. I want to recommend Rahul Jain's seminal and beautifully illustrated book, Rapture, The Art of Indian Textiles, the first to include textiles in many media woven or created during the 14th through 21st century. In Delhi, Carol Bier, Barbara Pickett, and I delighted in feasting with Jasleen Damija, the celebrated craft revivalist, textile specialist, and significant author whose books have inspired all of us. Jasleen's desire to meet velvet weaver Barbara Pickett was particularly endearing, confirming her textile passion. And now Anna Jolie will give her reasons for wanting to go to India.
Good evening or good afternoon. Louise and I had talked for years about traveling together to India to see Rahul Jain's drawlooms. When she suggested that we do the journey together with some more experienced colleagues, I was thrilled and immediately consented to join the group. I am currently researching Indian and Iranian textiles in the collection of the Abeck Stiftung. This is a textile museum in Rickesberg near Bern in Switzerland. As a museum curator, I believe that the best way to gain an understanding of textiles is to study the originals at first hand. This helps to get to know their characteristic compositions, colors, and weaving techniques. Traveling to see the original textiles and architectural settings is, in my opinion, indispensable for a true understanding of the material. Our visits to historical monuments in the company of well-renowned specialists of Islamic art added another dimension to making this trip a once-in-a-lifetime experience to me. And now Carol will introduce her reasons for joining the trip.
The questions that I brought concerned historical, technological, and cultural topics. My questions derived from my research on the corpus of 17th century Persian velvets at Rosenborg Palace in Copenhagen, and compound weaves more generally, focused on the drawloom technology and its history. Did the technology move from east to west or from west to east? And how might this technology have spread? Might the Astana finds in the National Museum in Delhi, excavated by Oral Stein in Western China in the early 20th century, contribute to our understanding? Related to these concerns, and with specific reference to drawloom weaving in India, what exactly is the process of tying up the Naqsh, and how does it work to control the pattern? Is there any historical connection to Central Asian weaving, and in particular to Bukhara, where the Naqshbandi order in Sufism originated? The Naqshband being the tire of the Naqsh, namely the master weaver, pattern designer, and harness maker. And thirdly, what relationships can be discerned between architecture and textiles? I'm interested in these relationships in connection with ongoing concerns I have regarding ongoing relationships among design, structure, technology, and function. In particular, I wanted to learn more about ornament in Mughal architecture and patterns in textiles, as observed on an earlier trip to India, and what historical relationships between Safavid Iran and Mughal India may have contributed to the similarities observed. Given how arcane these questions are, you can perhaps imagine how thrilled I was to participate and partake of a traveling seminar with 4 sympathetic, curious textile colleagues, not all of whom I knew, but now all dear friends. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Barbara Setsu Pickett.
Here, like the little drummer boy, I presented Rahul with a gift of one of my velvets and a precious Italian velvet wire. He graciously accepted. The main aim of my return trip was to fill in the gaps of my understanding of the velvet drawloom and its operations. For example, I puzzled, how can the master weaver control the 21 shafts with only 7 treadles and weave the pile, the satin, and facing wefts? And how does the woven velvet keep tension without being crushed while on the loom? And what are the tricks to find and repair broken threads? Few would bother, but the weaver in me did. Secondly, I wanted to know how the Naqshband, the master pattern harness maker, interprets a design sketch and turns it into the Naqsha, the system of knotted cords, the soul of the drawloom. At first, it seems mechanical, a series of pickup lifts. Then you notice subtleties. Like in music, the design sketch is the score, and the Naqshband is the conductor that breathes life into the notes. The artistry lies in making a myriad of finely tuned choices. What are the factors at play, and what are the underlying criteria at work? And now, Annin.
Hello, thanks, Barbara. My desire to go on this journey was threefold. First, Barbara Pickett's previous research trip to India fascinated me, especially because this is a country with a continuous, living tradition of handcrafted textiles, from ancient times through today. Barbara's work with handwoven silk velvet inspires me, and her study of Rahul Jain's project piqued my curiosity. This chance to visit weaving villages and meet textile artists was too good to pass up. Second, as a sustainable design educator, I hope to learn how the long heritage of textile creation in India could inform sustainable practices now. In particular, I wanted to see how a renewed interest in natural indigo dye in India, from where it originated, water conservation, and the concept of local production might help reinvent the future of textile and fashion design. From a designer friend at Nike, Namrata Amin, I had introductions to professors at 2 Indian design colleges that opened doors of potential research. And third, the prospect of traveling with 4 eminent textile scholars with access to seldom seen historic textile collections was a dream come true. Carol Bier's knowledge of Islamic architectural patterns reawakened a latent passion of mine. Louise Mackie helped me see connections between textiles and formal garden designs. And Barbara Pickett and Anna Jolie's deeply insightful explanations of Rahul Jain's looms all contributed to an extraordinary experience. Next, Carol Bier will discuss the connection between textiles and architecture.
I want to begin with one of the questions that was left inadequately answered on a previous trip to India. What relationships can be discerned between textiles and architecture? I anticipated answers that would entail proportional systems, symmetry as an aesthetic principle for both three-dimensional structures and two-dimensional patterns. And I expected to find both representations of architecture in textiles and of textiles in architecture. Next, please. I admit that I quickly learned how naive this question was, but having raised it, I was made more aware and my eyes and mind were open to new observations and concerns. An observation contrary to expectation was seeing fences made of old saris strung up to protect fields, here for the cultivation of orange and yellow calendula for garlands used in devotional settings, among other produce. I've listed here at the top several relationships of architecture and textiles, contrasting textiles as architecture, such as tents, and textiles in architecture, such as furniture and furnishings, and contrasting as well the representation of architecture in textiles and the representation of textiles in architecture. These contrasts are not unique to India, but are especially apt because of the rich traditions of both textiles and architecture, and the diverse technologies still at play. Needless to say, there is considerable overlap in these categories and much ambiguity, particularly regarding the representation of textile structures in architecture and architectural ornament. Next, please. The most familiar example of textiles as architecture is, of course, the tent. And in India, there is indeed a long history of royal tents, portable palaces, as well as military tents, likely derivative of an earlier history in Central Asia. Depicted on the left is a book illustration with a rich array of royal tents and a pavilion. Here again, as you see in the lower portion, a textile used to define exterior space, a wall. And there are awnings, canopies, and drapes, originally outfitted, on the right, an extant royal tent from Rajasthan in the 17th century, originally outfitted with reed screens, or cheek, recently shown at the Royal Ontario Museum. We see both in the installation and in the painting the use of textiles as architecture, as well as the use of textiles in architecture, showing the use of furnishings, including carpets, bedding, covers, bolsters, curtains, and canopies. Next, please. But then I got to thinking that some architectural features may actually reflect tent structures and forms, such as the roof lines and finials shown here at the top left, the amber fort atop the hall of private audience, the Diwani Has, of the Rajput rulers. Their striped exterior and interior surfaces reminiscent of striped textiles, mushroom, warp patterned in satin using silk warps and cotton wefts. The stripes and contrasting colors still preserved in the aesthetic choices of wedding tents today. Next, please. Two aspects of textiles in architecture that I hadn't thought of earlier were the ubiquitous presence of the traditional Indian rope beds, the charpai in lower right, so suitable to such a hot climate, with their signature interlacing, and the characteristic reed screens here to the left, used to shade light where cut grasses, reeds, form the weft. Next, please. Several experiments at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad led me to recognize adaptive textile structures. Where the weft is stiff, the warp may be manipulated as an embroidery, serving to create tessellations of deflected warp elements. This in turn raised my awareness of knotted netting used as a space divider, defining and enclosing space within an architectural setting. Next, please. As for textiles representing architecture, I will share 3 examples. The first referred to as khanat, depicting arches and columns, often on textiles that serve to line tent interiors. The second is the representation of Persian gardens with their characteristic 4-fold layout, the charbagh, that was taken over by the Mughals for the design of their own royal gardens. And the third, an anomaly to my mind, is the use of textiles in the construction of architectural models here in the form of a puppet theater. Next, please. Of textiles represented in architecture, I was most struck by the diverse array of panels of carved stone in the 11th century stepwell at Rani Ki Vav in Gujarat, with designs based on an oblique square grid, and how parallel these are to the resist-dyed patterning we saw nearby at Patan, where warp and weft ikat woven in plain weave is patterned by resist-dyed yarns prepared prior to weaving. Next, please. I was also very taken with the simple striped zigzag patterning we encountered in Agra at the Taj Mahal, executed in cut stone inlay, both in the characteristic local red sandstone and in the Taj Mahal's world-renowned white marble. In both instances, I see reference to the characteristic reverse repeats of split ply braiding and that of card weaving, charpana, a traditional textile technology in India and elsewhere in South and Central Asia. But we also found the same design executed using block printing, which you see at the lower right, and as well in velvet weaving. I would also like to draw your attention to another detail in carved marble at the center of the screen, center top, outlining the arched iwans of the Taj Mahal, a detail that I came to call plied marble or marble cords. Next, please. Akbar's tomb complex at Sikandra offered a medley of patterns in inlaid sandstone, many of which bear resemblance to textile patterns and structures. In particular, notice the 2 vertical panels, center left, which show an arrangement of square and rectangular elements, and a detail to the right, which range in proportion of 3 to 2 to 1, which I liken again to card weaving, but it could as well be tapestry or kilim, and I found a parallel also in Gujarati embroidery with mirror work at far right. Next, please. Showing a more complex level of patterning in 2 dimensions, here in a vaulted ceiling on the left, also at Akbar's tomb at Sikandra, we may see a design, a floral ornament with cloud bands and geometry, which find parallels in the Indo-Persian carpets, this one from the Prince Albert Hall Museum in Jaipur. As a scholar, I know full well that questions lead to more questions, and the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. In my last slide, next please, I would like to address all too briefly my revelation concerning the Naqsha, the enigmatic device that is historically used to implement a repeat pattern in drawloom weaving. What looks like a messy bundle of strings is really a compressed bundle of logic. Like magic, it serves to program the warps during weaving, which through raising and lowering enables the weaving of a design that is integral with the ground weave, affecting its repetition to form a pattern. I wanted to share my epiphany regarding this messy form of logic with its inherent portability and to suggest how that very well may have served historically in the transmission of this advanced technology across Asia. Many questions remain, but our traveling seminar greatly enlarged my understanding of this advanced and complex weaving technology and how lucky we were to have Barbara Setsu Pickett with us. We'll hear from her later, but I would now like to turn the program over to Anna Jolie and Louise Mackie, who will talk to us about historical textile collections we visited.
On our first day in Delhi, we visited the National Museum, more precisely the Department of Central Asian Art, where we spent all day on a Saturday. That might be surprising. Our visit had initially been programmed for Friday, but it had to be postponed because of a VIP visit to the museum. It turned out to be the President of Portugal. But here we are in the Department of Central Asian Art, in the storage facility, to be more precise, in the company of Dr. Binoy Sahai, who very graciously received us on a Saturday together with his assistant. We had the privilege to look at several textiles from the collection of Sir Aurel Stein that was assembled in the early 20th century in Astana in Western China. And it was quite a revelation to me that part of the Aurel Stein collection is not only in London today, which is probably well known to you, but also held in the National Museum in New Delhi. Carol Bier had, in advance of our visit, sent a list of textiles we would have liked to see, and her choice was very educational in the way that it showed different kind of techniques and different origins of textiles. And I would like to show you a few examples of the textiles that we saw there on that day. On the left here, you see a fragment of a very fine tapestry weaving which must have originated in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 3rd to 4th century and somehow found its way to Western China, probably along the Silk Road. And on the right, you see a charming little resist-dyed silk fabric from China from the 7th to the 9th century, so that would be Tang period China, which was also in the Stein collection. And another example on the left here is a warp patterned woven silk with warps in different colors, as you see in the macro photo to the right of it, blue, brown, green, and whitish warps, which make up this pattern of Chinese cloud bands, stylized animals, and inscriptions which have been deciphered. And I would like to draw your attention to the publication here on the right, which was a recent publication and includes an article by Binoy Sahai with a kind of catalogue of the textiles from the Aurel Stein collection that are now housed in New Delhi. All the textiles are accompanied by photographs and detailed technical analysis which were done by Rahul Jain. A couple of days later, we went to the National Museum again to visit the Department of Decorative Art, where we saw some later textiles. Louise, would you like to say something about these?
Yes, thank you, Anna. Deputy Curator Dr. Zahri Ali Ansari showed us brightly colored, excuse me. He showed us brightly colored cotton fabrics for two reasons. India is a cotton culture and had developed its color-fast dye technology by about 1600. This cotton arcade displays imaginary trees made in laborious techniques, hand-drawn, resist, and mordant-dyed, which is sometimes called chintz. They form the interior walls of royal tents or enclosure walls called qanats, as seen in the painting on the right. Please notice also in the painting that all the figures are wearing long sashes which fall gracefully in the front of their garments. Rulers traveled extensively for all kinds of political, military, and pleasure reasons, and they slept in palatial encampments. These panels survived in the Amber Palace in Jaipur with an inventory tag dated 1645. Next, please. Emperor Shah Jahan built the Red Fort in Delhi as his main residence, with 3 marble pavilions for public and private audiences. They're open on all 4 sides to walled pleasure gardens. This beautiful pavilion features elegant floral decoration made with semi-precious stones. Blossoming plants were Shah Jahan's signature motifs, influenced by European botanicals and by radiant flora in Kashmir. But I was most excited when I noticed the rings across the top, which are identified on the screen. And what are they for? Textile hangings. Next, please. And in another view of the same pavilion, there are more rings under the eaves for textile awnings. Next, please. This is the same private audience hall, fully rigged, showing preparations for Emperor Akbar Shah's departure in 1817. It suggests how Shah Jahan might have used the pavilion, also with red, the royal color, but luxurious, and I quote, red velvet embroidered with gold, according to the French jeweler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. The main image shows the awning secured by weights in the foreground, and the detail on the left shows large textile hangings. They're on the right side, where you can see the lower portion of the textile hanging down. The left detail also shows a very large textile hanging with the pulley system, showing how they were raised and lowered. So we have a very large hanging on the left, and then across the front, you can see a raised door panel in the middle of canop panels that are actually connecting to an adjacent building that are for the baths. Next, please. Gira Sarabhai is an important lady in our story. She was from a wealthy philanthropic family in Ahmedabad. She founded the Calico Museum of Textiles in 1949. She's now 96. It has the foremost textile collection in India and displays over 1,000 textiles in each gallery, where we had a excellent guided tour. Here you can see blossoming plants in architectural arcades that are enlivening a huge cotton tent ceiling, over 630 centimeters in length or over 20 feet. And there are matching wall panels from the early 19th century. Afterwards, we saw luxury Mughal silks. Emperor Akbar raised the quality and the prestige of silk fabrics by hiring foreign masters, many from Iran, to train Indian workers in the late 1500s, according to Abul Fazl's history, the Aini Akbari. Anna Jolie will present them now.
I would like to show you 2 Mughal silks in particular, which struck our attention because they're so spectacular. On the left here, you see a spectacular lampas weaving, in fact, a tent panel, which is very large. It is higher than a person. You see the dimensions there in the caption. This is a lampas weave. I may remind you, this is a flat weave with 2 different weave structures, one for the ground and one for the pattern. The ground in this case is a red satin, and the pattern wefts are bound by the binding warp in a twill. It is a single flower motif, which is very rare. these single flower motifs exist in velvet as well, and in this case in lampas, but there are something like 10 examples around the world of these survive, so it is very rare and very special. It has a hugely high repeat, and you see that the single flower here is standing underneath an arch, which has scrolling flowers in the spandrels. And of the single flower motif itself, you see there's a vertical symmetrical axis, but otherwise there is no repetition in the motif at all. There are different kind of blossoms, there's some buds as well, different kind of leaves, like an evolving flower, like the quintessence of different stages of the growing evolution of this flower in a way. And you can well imagine that it is impossible to put all the program for this hugely high repeat into the loom all at once. In order to weave this, one would have to divide the whole design into different sections and weave one after the other. So the weaving program would be divided into something like 5 sections, and for each section a separate program or Naqsha, so this bundle of logic Carol was talking about, would have to be prepared, and each Naqsha would then be mounted consecutively onto the loom in order to weave this one after the other. So a huge tour de force in a way to produce this fantastic length of lampas. On the right you see what is Rahul Jain's photographic reconstruction of what several lengths of this tent panel must have looked like when they were mounted together to assemble a tent. Flower motifs were, of course, the favorites of Shah Jahan in the 17th century. We saw comparable flower motifs in the architecture that was commissioned by Shah Jahan. And generally, it is agreed that these flowers and plant motifs in general are often not botanically identifiable, but they are sort of art inspired by nature. So some examples of architecture which we saw, which reminded me of the lampas we had seen, is seen here. In the middle is a sandstone carving from the mid-17th century from the Red Fort, a huge gate inside the Red Fort, which was commissioned by Shah Jahan, which was a kind of palace complex he had built for himself. And here again, you see a similar kind of flower in a niche with similar blossoms and leaves. And on the right is a detail of the pietra dura inlay on the facade of the Taj Mahal, where you see scrolling flowers of similar type and coloring as the floral scrolls which are found in the spandrels on the lampas. And it was great fun, I say, to see these comparisons as we were visiting the monuments and to remember the textiles we had seen and to see these parallels. A second Mughal textile I would like to show you here is the velvet panel on the left here. And at first, I would like to draw your attention to the border, the bordering velvet around it. So this chevron patterned red pile velvet on golden ground. A chevron pattern which is found a lot in India in the 17th century, not only in Mughal art, but also in the state of the Rajput princes. So here we have an example. This is a water channel with an inlay marble chevron pattern found in Jaipur in Armour Fort, the summer palace at Armour Fort of the Rajput rulers. So not only in the Mughal Empire, but also in the Rajasthan, in the state of Rajasthan, these chevron patterns were popular in the 17th century. Velvet, I should perhaps emphasize, is the most, or was the most luxurious and expensive fabric since it first appeared in the 15th century. I think this holds true not only for India, but of course also for Europe and for the entire Middle East, I would say. That velvet is the most material intensive, labor intensive fabric that has been produced. It takes 6 times as much warp material to produce a velvet with its pile than it needs to produce a flat textile. And therefore velvet was always a kind of textile into which a lot of effort and a lot of artistic effort as well went into. Now, looking more closely at the main panel here, here's a detail on the left. We see the velvet, the pile is found in the flower motifs. The ground is covered with a gilt metal thread, a supplementary weft here. And I would like to look a little at the composition of this velvet. We see 2 different kinds of flowers that are offset in rows. They are in horizontal rows. And all of the flowers within one row are looking into the same direction. This is a characteristic of Indian textiles in contrast to Iranian textiles. This observation, of course, has been published before by Rahul Jain, Louise, Mackie, and Bier. What a privilege to be traveling with these eminent scholars and to be my attention to have been drawn to these characteristics. I would like to share this with you here again. Similar flower motifs we had seen in the architecture that we visited. Here on the right is one example, a marble relief on a facade, actually the facade leading into the entrance of the Taj Mahal in Agra, completed in 1643, which gives us a hint as to the dating of the velvet, I would say. You see similar blossoms here, this sort of 2-layer blossoms and very closely related serrated leaves of the plant here that are realized in the green and cream color velvet on the left. The Calico Museum has been exemplary in publishing their holdings, their textile holdings, and I think virtually all of the textiles that are exhibited in the museum have been published. They have a very active publication program, and one of the great series of books they have published is a series called Technical Studies Monographs. There are 3 of them by now, and they were all written by Rahul Jain on specific types of fabrics. One of them is on velvets, another one is on lampas, and the third one is about Indian sashes or patkas. And these are really worthwhile acquiring. The monographs contain very detailed technical analysis of the textiles catalog therein. And he includes these beautiful thread models of their technical structures, which I found extremely helpful in understanding the technique of these velvets. And for people who are interested in details, I'm not going to explain about velvet weaving just now, because Barbara Pickett is going to explain that in detail later. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we see here the Indian velvet contains 3 ground wefts. This again is a distinguishing characteristic of Indian velvets in comparison to Iranian velvets, which contain 4 ground wefts. So if you have the chance to study these textiles under the microscope, you will find an attribution criterion by these particular technical features. The technique of velvet weaving was probably brought by brought to India by Iranian weavers. You might know this. And there was an interchange of the various technical features. But nevertheless, the Indians developed their own technique, which helps us now in making attribution. I think one can generalize this point even in saying that there was a very lively exchange between Indian and Iranian art in the time of Shah Jahan. And this also holds true for the subject of sashes, which Louise might be able to tell you some more about now.
The outstanding textile collection in the Bharhat Kala Bhavan, the University Museum of Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi, is second only to the Calico Museum. The collection's outstanding. Curator Dr. Priyanka Chandra showed us the lavish shawl on the left, or patka, attributed to Shah Jahan. It was woven in 3 compound structures, one for the field, one for the side borders, and a third for the end panel. Rahul Jain calls it tailored on the loom, and it's similar to the Textile Museum sash that changed his life from being an economist to textile scholar. A century later, on the right, the Kashmiri Royal Pashmina sash with a rare red and white field displays dense upright floral bows in the end borders, which are typical of its period. Next, please. This renowned garden carpet was woven in Kirman, Iran, around 1600. It is the earliest extant complete carpet with the paradisical 4-garden plan, Chahar Bagh, of ancient Iranian origin. With a bird's eye view, vertical and horizontal watercourses intersect with an elevated pavilion in the central pool, which is particularly visible on the left side. The watercourses reveal fish, waterfowl, and land animals, while colorful trees and plants grow from their banks. Its technique and vibrant colors confirm its Kirman origin in Iran, and it survived in the Amber Palace in Jaipur with a label dated 1632. Next, please. Below the Amber Palace in the Yamuna River, we can see a 4-garden plan, the Chahar Bagh. It was introduced by Babur, the first Mughal emperor, and influenced by 15th century Iranian gardens in Central Asia, as Carol referred to earlier. Babur built a mausoleum in a Chahar Bagh for his son, Humayun, in 1569-70 in Delhi. Next, please. The finest Chahar Bagh garden forms the paradisical setting for the Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan in memory of his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, in Agra. The Taj Mahal sits on a raised marble platform at the end of the quadripartite garden, instead of in the center, elevating its majesty and reflection in the watercourse. 5 fountains enlivened the central pool. Quadrants divided into subquadrants abounded with decorative flora, fragrant blossoming plants, and fruit trees, some with funerary associations. For Muslims and for many, the Taj Mahal complex and gardens are symbols of paradise on earth. And I would like to add now, after hearing James Turner speak about Persian carpets this morning in section 9A, he emphasized the duality, and in particular reference to a garden carpet of a simpler later design. He specified that the flowers were flowers by day and scent, the aroma by night. And this is actually confirmed by a night garden that was built directly across the Yamuna River from the Taj Mahal, which has been excavated in recent years with information which unfortunately I couldn't find out about due to coronavirus restrictions, et cetera. But it brings us full circle on the symbolism and significance of this very beautiful garden plan. Thank you. And I would now like to pass this to Barbara Pickett, who will speak about Rahul Jain's drawlooms.
Thank you, Anna and Louise. That was wonderful to revisit those sublime textiles. And it so reminds me that we saw the Taj Mahal 3 times, and one was at dawn, and one was from across the river, you know, from the moonlit garden, and the last was at evening. And we were the last. They actually swept us out the door, and it was delightful. Well, now we're going to get technical, so I hope you don't mind. At first, the Indian drawloom seems a bewildering sea of fine silk thread, but a loom is just a tool to hold warps and tension. Locate the warp and trace it from the woven cloth here below the red arrow back to the source on the warp beam by the green arrow. What keeps the tension? The true loom has devices to create sheds, the essential space made when a selection of warp threads are lifted, thus creating 2 planes, above and below the crossing weft. What makes the warp rise or sink? Notice 2 systems work in unison. A bank of shafts controlled by treadles, and to the right, a complex mass of knotted string, the pattern harness, the Naqsha. The person perched on the board manipulates the vertical draw cords that make the pattern sheds. The weaver operates the treadles that move the shafts, clears sheds, throws shuttles, and beats to make the cloth firm. In Rahul's diagram, shafts and treadles control the ground weave, green arrow, and the Naqsha controls the pattern, red arrow. Each warp end is threaded twice, once through a heddle on the rising shaft and once on a heddle on a sinking shaft. Simple weave structures and small patterns can be done on shafts alone, but large designs and more complex weave structures beg for more mechanical assist. Enter the Naqsha, the pattern harness. The Naqsha controls the fancy pattern design. The ground makes the cloth stable. The pattern is like the prima ballerina in the spotlight, while the ground is the corps de ballet doing the grunt work, building the foundation. Indian shaft looms generally lack the counterbalancing mechanism to increase the height of sheds. Instead, each rising shaft has a corresponding sinking shaft. The heddles on the shafts don't have an eye through which the warp passes. Instead, the heddle is a clasp of an upper and a lower thread loop. The warp passes above the clasp on the rising shaft and below on the sinking shaft. The pattern harness has 4 components: the horizontal cross cords, the leashes that loop down from the cross cords and circle around the warps of several warps. Knotted to the cross warps are the draw cords, and looping through the draw cords are the lashes that select the draw cords for that pattern shed. To keep order, each lash is tied to a master cord in sequence, like beads on a string. In Varanasi, cross cords are called paja, leases naka, draw cords Naqsha dori, and lasha keva. When the pattern repeats 4 times across the width of the warp, you'll see 4 sets of these naka lashes. See the Naqsha lashes here to make 4-point repeats across the width of the warp. The insert shows the woven velvet with its band of 4 medallions offset by a band of 3, like brickwork. Each medallion has a vertical line of reflection. The right side mirrors the left side. The 4 peaks could be the center of the 4 medallions, and the 3 valleys could be the center of the offset bands, finishing with a half medallion on either side. Traditionally, highly skilled artisans specialized in making the pattern harnesses for drawlooms. They are called Naqshband. We visited a renowned master, Nasim Ahmad, in his atelier. His equipment couldn't be simpler: a wooden frame called a machan and a bamboo pick. But his knowledge of design and weave structure is vast. He tensions strong cotton cores that will be the vertical draw cores when installed. The number of cores is determined by the width of the design unit and the set of the warp and the chosen warp step. He twines the upper and lower end to make the cords lie evenly across the width of his frame. Formerly, the designs were drawn full scale on sheet mica, as opera. This design motif is asymmetrical, having no axis of reflection. It is like an island surrounded by ground weave. Nasim translates it into the Naqsha by overlapping a grid on the motif that subdivides it into the 8 columns wide by 7 rows high. Each column will guide the selection for 12 vertical draw cords, or 96 Naqsha dori total. The sum of the rows will be the total number of the cross cords in the paja. The thickness of the line, the smoothness of the curve is determined by his trained eye. Nasim has blackened every 12th draw cord so that he can easily see the 8 columns. Okay. And he has marked every 16th horizontal string to define the rows. Using his bamboo pick, he selects the draw cords, considering all the factors at play and the demands of the weave structure. In the slide, he has already inserted 16 horizontal strings and made the leaf shape for column 2, row 1. Each horizontal string will become a keva lash. The 2 vertical cords to the right make a cross, keeping the sequence for the master cord. The math for the Naqsha calculates the size of the woven motif, the weave structures, and the découpure. This motif, I believe, for brocade with 5 colors, better shows Nasim's artistry and sense of design. The motif he did for us was simplified to show the process. Okay, now for the jacquard weavers. So I'm a weaver, and so this is for you weavers. In jacquard, the repeat is based on the precise number of hooks in the head, while the Naqsha isn't restricted to a certain number. In jacquard, the comber bore determines the width and density of the warp, while the Naqsha is free to vary. The jacquard is expensive and replacement parts are difficult to find, while the Naqsha is just cleverly knotted string. In jacquard, lingos weight down the pattern heddles, while on the drawloom, the downward slant of the warp keeps the tension on the nakalises and doesn't require space below. The jacquard cylinder can turn in reverse for several cards, but works best rotating forward, while the draw person can easily plow the keva lashes in reverse order for weaving like diamond shapes. The jacquard is heavy machinery and noisy to operate, while the quiet Naqsha makes for a pleasant working environment. Storing a jacquard mounting takes a big crate, and the pattern cord loop is bulky, while the Naqsha is compressible, portable, and lightweight. And as Carol Bier so aptly put it, the Naqsha is a messy bundle of logic. I'm toying with applying some of the Naqsha concepts to my shaft loom to increase the design options. I have 24 shafts, but you can always use more. To do supplementary embellishments and spot effects. Nassim's son proudly hosts the fabric that won Nassim's the National Award in 2008. Nassim's great-grandfather won the National Award in 1965 and his grandfather in 1973. Will there be a next generation? His son was there in the studio with us and was helping out, but it's whether he has a job in the future there. Who knows? Now about velvet. Velvet is a pile weave. It has two sets of warps. The pile warp makes the tuff and the ground warp the foundation and plain weave, twill, or satin. The pile warp jumps over a slim wire and then gets woven into the ground. Generally, 3 velvet wires are woven in before the first can be safely removed. Polychrome velvets have sets of piles of different colors. At any point in the design, a particular color can be summoned to show itself, like in this velvet of rose. Rose reinvented velvet drawloom is a feat in experimental textile technology. Master weaver Shamin Ansari collaborated closely with Rahul Jain, a postgraduate student in textiles from the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, to build this drawloom and its support apparatus and tools. This loom is unique, designed to handle these particular polychrome velvets. Modifications would be expected for other types of velvets and other design demands. The pile warp is organized into 4 banks, 2 on each side of the narrow aisle that provides access for repairs. Each bank has 10 slats with 350 piles for each of the 3 colors, making 1,400 piles for each color, or the total number of piles 4,200. The triad of piles closest to the left selvage comes from the highest slat on the left closest to the weaver. The pile closest to the right selvage comes from the lowest slat on the right. The piles are kept in strict order by a second reed placed on top of the ground warp beam and with crosses. Each slat is drilled with 35 groups of 3 holes on a diagonal. The top hole is for the green pile, the middle for the deep yellow, and the bottom for the red. Each pile unit is wound separately on its own pern and dangles with a little weight like a plumb bob. The textile terms I learned from the weavers are of the local Hindi vernacular and stem from the Varanasi weaving tradition. The reed, right next here to the yellow arrow, the reed, the fani, is the metal comb set into the beater that establishes the weaving width and organizes the density, the set of the warp. For this velvet, the reed has 40 dents in 1 inch. Each dent, called a gar, holds 3 pile units, 1 of each color, and 5 ground warps. It is 36 inches wide, including selvages, made of 6 strong cords. The 21 shafts, the kandi, are organized from the reed back to the naqsha. 3 to sink the pile, 5 to sink the satin ground, 3 to raise the pile, 5 to raise the 1 to 4 facing weft, 5 to raise the satin ground. Shamin operates the 7 treadles called paiori, 2 for the pile and 5 for the satin ground. They're in the pit below. When a satin treadle is suppressed, 4 shafts rise and 1 sink. 4 artisans work together to weave this velvet. It takes steady, measured action and unfaltering attention. To start, Shamin cuts out the first velvet wire. Biel, perched behind the Naqsha, pulls the keva lash and lifts the crosscord. He inserts a large wooden fork tool, the mantha, and twists it to clear the selection. Shamin's wife, Rijvana, inserts the left anka hook to hold the selection, and Shamin balances with a hook on the right. She then clears the shed with a rod so Shamin can enter the velvet wire, and he holds it in place by pressing the reed to the wire. He makes the shed for the first satin weft, throws the shuttle, beats, returns it for the second satin weft. For the third satin weft, he also raises the pile units for the crucial interlacement. He continues with the fourth satin weft. And here is the trick I didn't catch the first time around. Biel makes the shed for the 1 to 4 facing weft by pulling and lifting draw cords. Shamin changes shuttles, throws, beats in the first facing weft. Biel makes the second facing weft shed. Shamin returns the shuttle and beats firmly. This completes one cycle for one velvet wire. This process is repeated approximately 34 times for 1 inch of woven fabric. A good day's work might average a few inches. The full design repeat takes about 300 velvet wires. Here is Biel inserting the mantha hook, twist it to raise the selection of draw cords. The Naqsha is customized for the specific design on a particular loom. Since this medallion design has a vertical and horizontal axis of reflection, the Naqsha could have been built on a quadrant of the motif, with the rest generated through the Naqsha leases. There are many solutions, but according to Rahul, since this is such a large, intricate design, they chose to organize it into 2 Naqsha, one for the top of the medallion and the other for the bottom. Shamin uses a naked razor blade to cut out the velvet wire. He constantly sharpens it on the hardwood upright on his right side. I was delighted to give him a handcrafted velvet knife, like the one my teacher, Vittorio Rettori at the Foundation Visio in Florence, Italy, made and gave me. Actually, my husband made it. Okay, the knife. Once woven, the velvet wire once woven, the velvet winds over a special front beam that has a large diameter covered in material like needleboard or card clothing, which adds friction and maintains the tension. Then it travels down over 2 padded rollers and loosely winds on a third beam. Rahul described this carpet-like velvet as, quote, a Safavid velvet with a Mughal flavor. To me, it's reminiscent of a bird's eye view of a floral landscape. The tiny, shiny spots are the only voids. The rest is solid velvet. Okay. Sparkle like drops of water. Unfortunately, we lack the time to delve into the workings of Rahul's other drawlooms. I especially want to investigate the mysteries of Lampas. So we saw the Lampas and also the Samit and Takate looms. They're also in Cholapur. Our 5 days together culminated with a feast at the Hotel Ganges View in the company of Rahul's dear friends, who are equally passionate about textiles. We were able to express our thanks and bid farewell. They in turn warmly expressed their gratitude to Carol for her book, Woven from the Soul, Spun from the Heart, and to Louise for her tome, Symbols of Power. When Louise and Carol signed their books, I thought this is the full circle, the power of research, sharing knowledge across time and space. A trip builds relationships and serves as a vector pointing the way to future research. And now Annin and Barrett will speak about schools, exhibitions, and current movements.
Hello, my name is Annin. My quest to learn about fine textiles and how they are rooted in geographical place or architectural site was rewarded in so many ways on this trip. I'm going to tell you about the design colleges we visited, Indian Institute of Crafts and Design, as well as the National Institute of Design, sometimes called the Bauhaus of India, and some important exhibits of Indian textiles by contemporary artists that we got to see. It will become apparent that the historic focus of my colleagues' research has great currency today, especially in regard to sustainable design. I had an introduction to Professor Chaudhuri at the Indian Institute of Crafts and Design in Jaipur, where we were invited to a sumptuous faculty tea. We discussed sustainable fashion design curriculum and were given a tour of the textile classrooms. Faculty members showed us weaving studios and a courtyard where students and traditional textile artisans from the community could sell their handcrafted products, like you see on the right, while informally learning from each other. After seeing great historic Islamic architectural sites in Delhi and Agra, and realizing their symmetrical and spatial relationships to textiles, we were pleased that Professor Jain led us to a fashion draping class at this college taught by visiting faculty from Iran, Professor Jahanara, that used Iranian architecture for design inspiration, confirming our observations about the interplay of patterns between Mughal architecture and textiles. Students were challenged to make zero-waste muslin garment samples, echoing shapes found in forts, mosques, and mausoleums from an entire piece of cloth. The faculty also insisted that we visit Neela House, named after the Sanskrit word for blue, a new center in Jaipur for natural indigo dyeing and handcrafted textiles. We went there directly. Neela House opened in November 2019. This site is a beautiful 1940s residence recently redesigned by architect Rahul Jain using traditional building methods. The courtyard and textiles on display there echoed the way canopies and pavilions interrelated in historic sites we had just visited. Neela House holds gallery exhibits and workshops that bring together traditional Indian textile artists and designers dedicated to sustainable practices. We were lucky to see their inaugural exhibit, Revisiting Traditions, a showcase of artisanal fabrics from Kutch in Gujarat that successfully endeavored to celebrate the excellence of fabric making, as well as the finished garments. Neela House is a center for elevating the status of textile arts and artists in India. This show included textiles created with indigo by 5 artists, including Bandhani by Aziz Khatri, and a fashion collection created by designer Ujjiwal Dubey, made from hand-woven fabrics by Kimchi Karavankar. The intent of this exhibit was to celebrate the aesthetic value of the indigo textiles themselves and the artists who made them. We met technical lead Juhi Pandey, who coincidentally told us she had just submitted an abstract for TSA's Symposium about the changing social status of female weavers in Kutch. I was thrilled to hear this paper she co-presented with textile artist Rajiban Bankar at this symposium on Thursday, titled Reclaiming Traditions. What a Small World. Barbara Pickett had an invitation from Suki Skidmore, the curator at the Anoki Museum of Handprinting, to come visit. This museum, with its excellent publications authored by Suki Skidmore, has exhibits of mordant resist and block printed fabrics from Bagru and other nearby towns that explain their cultural context as an experience of local place. Certain print patterns traditionally denote social standing, such as being a widow, as well as identify the region where they are worn by their colors and motifs. In a new book and upcoming exhibit, block carvers from Farrukhabad tell their own story of their art form and the history of their city. From Suki Skidmore, we got a special invitation to visit the Anoki brand factory workrooms at Anoki Farm on the outskirts of Jaipur. We were welcomed there by the manager, who led us through the dye works, block printing studios, cutting rooms, and the sample library of this progressive company. They use natural and low toxin dyes on cotton fabric, including indigo. Very aware of environmental problems with dye pollution, they recapture almost all dye water in large tanks on site, filter, and reuse it. We were struck by how this resonates with water canal systems from Mughal architecture, where clean water was a highly prized element of the garden. Anoki Farm is proud of having long-term employees and even provides childcare on site for workers. Following the theme of indigo, we were pleased to learn that Michelle Garcia and Yoshiko Wada would be in Ahmedabad at the same time we were to give a lecture on natural indigo at the very hotel, the House of MG, where we were staying. At this hotel is a museum that had an astonishing exhibit of 19th century brocade and jamdani saris and double interlocking twill tapestry shawls from the collection of the Mangaldas family, guest curated by Aditi Ranjan, who is the mentor of my designer friend back in Oregon. This was quickly added to our itinerary. The lecture on indigo drew about 100 textile designers from the National Institute of Design and beyond for a riveting evening of discussion about the color blue. Michelle Garcia said that he was able to give a more in-depth talk about the science of indigo to this audience because of their level of textile knowledge. Afterward, Carol Bier talked with one of the attendees, designer Paresh Patel, who invited us to his studio outside of Ahmedabad in the village of Ridwal. Of course, we had to go. Paresh Patel owns Royal Brocades, a weaving workshop that produces elegant silk ikats and also fabrics in the Ashwali brocade tradition that dates back hundreds of years. There, on the wall of Paresh Patel's office, was a Naqsha, the same coded string bundle we had studied in Varanasi with Rahul Jain. Patel told us that his father had used the Naqsha, but that they were replaced by jacquard mechanisms in the 1980s. Today, dozens of looms at Patel's workshops are leased to local weavers, forming a small manufacturing hub. The coronavirus makes this a difficult time for everyone, but this workshop has withstood the challenges of COVID-19 better than larger industrial textile mills and their mass layoff of workers. Patel mainly uses natural dyes, including indigo, for his textiles, and often posts his latest projects and opinions on Instagram. Indigo is also the focus of a huge modern-day cotton denim corporation, Arvind, headquartered in Ahmedabad. Although they use synthetic indigo now, they promise the implementation of more sustainable practices in the near future. To that end, they've sponsored a museum at the Kasturbai Lalbhai complex dedicated to indigo, and we got to see their premiere exhibit titled Alchemy, featuring dozens of artists' works from all over the world in many media. Plaster, aluminum, and many textiles continued the theme of architectural references with archways, stairs, walls, and spatial settings, such as these arches created by the legs of jeans. Anna and Louise have already told you about our wonderful visit to the Calico Museum in a nearby former home of the Sarabhai family that was co-founded by Gira Sarabhai. But one of Gira Sarabhai's many other achievements was co-founding the National Institute of Design's Textile program. On the morning of our last day together, the 5 of us travelers met textile arts faculty Swasti Singh Ghai and Shafiq Afzal at National Institute of Design for a scheduled 30-minute visit. But time flies when textile people get together. 2 hours later, we were still excitedly talking about fabric and were taken to see the famous Pupil Jayakar volumes in the National Institute of Design library. These 7 large books holding thousands of hand-spun woven cotton fabric swatches known as khadi from everywhere in India are revered as a touchstone of national pride. They represent many different cotton varieties and a wide selection of hand-spun cotton yarns and hand-woven textures specific to regional places. Since Mahatma Gandhi, there has been a deep cultural connection with hand-spinning cotton as an act of empowerment and decolonization through local production called Swadeshi that was quite prophetic in regard to sustainable fashion's principle of local supply chains. At Gandhi's ashram, where we also visited in Ahmedabad, spinning wheels represent the independence movement, the unbroken traditions of Indian craftspeople, and provide the source of inspiration for a sustainable future. It was hard to top seeing all the Pupil Jayakar volume variations of indigenously grown, spun, and woven cottons, but Professor Afzal had another great experience for us. The 50th anniversary exhibit of National Institute of Design's textile program that he had co-curated. At this exhibit, outstanding documentation of master's theses on ikat, patola cloth, and other artisanal textile traditions all over India overwhelmed us. One graduate thesis by Abhishek Jain involved him in Rahul Jain's reinvention of the drawlooms at Cholapur that Barbara just showed us. This respect given to textile structures and design at the highest level of achievement is visionary. We also noted that sustainable textile practices, such as local supply chains and natural dyes, are recognized as a valuable part of India's textile heritage as well as its future. This impressive archived research is a foundation ready to inspire the next generation of textile artists and designers. Back in Varanasi, Rahul Jain had told us about Gira Sarabhai's connection with many modern designers like Charles Eames, Alexander Calder, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Le Corbusier, who all came to India. Even the artist Frank Stella, who designed calligraphic saris. Rahul referenced a book by Shanae Javeri called Western Artists in India about this topic. Now, here in the exhibit in Ahmedabad were textiles by designers Dorothy Liebes and Jack Leonard Larson, showing undeniable influence from traditional Indian fabrics. This was an epiphany for me. Of course. In the lower middle of the screen, compare the colorways in this cotton plaid, typically worn as lungis by Indian workers, with Dorothy Liebes wovens. On the left, consider how a katab applique jacket from Gujarat would have informed Jack Leonard Larson's design sensibility for these textile prints above it. Read Aditi and M.P. Ranjan's work, Bamboo and Cane Crafts, to realize that woven bamboo and reed screens, like on the right, were traditional architectural textiles in Northeast India long before they became a staple of modernist domestic interiors in the West. Modernism may have developed at the Bauhaus in Germany, but its textiles, art, and architecture were clearly inspired and nurtured in India. There is a lot of research still to do on India's profound influence on Western design history, so far mostly uncredited. This exhibit was a thrilling finale to a fabulous trip with so many possible avenues to continue exploring. I want to thank the TSA organizers for providing this forum. I'm looking forward to questions and comments on the Q&A that Carol Bier is going to moderate.
Thank you. That was great, Annin. and thank all of our panelists. We are thrilled to have you here. I see that we've had more than 80 participants attending. Sorry we can't see you. I know you can see us, and I hope that we'll be able to see you at the next Biennial Symposium. We want to thank you all for joining us in this recounting of our journey. And as our knowledge continues, we'd like to address your questions. And I see that there are quite a number of questions that have come in. And I wonder if any of you have further questions that you'd like to address to any of the panelists or to all of us. And I'll begin with two that can be just quickly dispensed. Kartika asked about the calendula that I showed in the fields that were surrounded by fences of old saris. And marigold is Calendula officinalis. So the common name marigold actually is two different Latin botanical names, but calendula is one of them. So that's fine. And she also commented that flowers by day and scent by night, which Louise quoted James Turner this morning, how poetic that is. Another quick question to address is from Julie Holyoke about the Rajput tent that was shown that had been at the Royal Ontario Museum. Yes, that is made of red velvet on a gold ground, and it resides in the Mehrangarh Fort Museum in Jodhpur. A question from Marilyn Robert, wonderful presentation. I appreciate the comparison, this is for Barbara, of jacquard and Naqsha weaving equipment and usage. Several people said they were deeply jealous of our wonderful trip. And thank you to all of those who mentioned that we were broadcasting live when we didn't yet know it. Let's see, are there other questions coming in while I look through the rest? Again, from Kartika to Anna. Do you think the symmetry in the large tent lampas may have played a role in the Naqsha? I'm not sure of the questioning. I would have reversed the order. But Anna, do you want to address that, or Barbara or Louise?
Yeah, I understand. Yes, I think absolutely it will influence the Naqsha in that the technical repeat as opposed to the pattern repeat is of course only half of the width of this lampas. The height is without any repetition, but it's because there's a symmetrical axis in the middle, a vertical symmetry axis in the middle. One would only need to read half of the width of the fabric into the Naqsha and then just mirror it while weaving. So it certainly influences the making of the Naqsha, and it economizes half of the programming, so to say, of the loom. I hope that answers the question.
I think I'd like to add is that it occurred to me if you had 5 Naqsha for that design, you could have one for the top and then one for the bottom thing, and you could actually then repeat the middle as high as you wanted to go to fit the space you were going to enter. If it was all in one, then you would be more confined to a particular height. And I thought that shows more flexibility, I think, and that is the crowning jewel of the Naqsha, is its flexibility.
But don't you think the design would have to be figured out at the begining and sort of fixed in some kind of drawing before you start making Naqshas?
I'm sure. I mean, that's what I think. What we saw with Nassim is that there is so much that goes into that. I mean, it looks so simple. You have this little bamboo pick and you're going to just lift something, but there's so much that is already decided, and the amount of math that it takes to get all that organized is quite formidable.
Well, I would add that one of the things that I think is distinctive about the lampus that you showed us, Anna, is its height. It's a particularly large pattern. And so the subdividing of it makes, that's essential. But then Barbara's point is that basically you can just weave any height, but you do have.
Theoretically, you could weave any height. It just becomes a huge practical problem at some point.
Right, you have to keep track of your naqshas. You have to weave them in sequence, or you, yeah.
I think I saw in the question about the other, the 5 different drawlooms that Rahul had set up. I only knew about the velvet in 2016, and he just sprung on to us that he was going to show us the samit and takate and also the lampus. And so so we got to see those 3 of the 5. And I think I stayed with the velvet loom because I still hadn't puzzled it out. And the rest of the group went on and saw another loom. So.
2 lovely comments. One from Kartika. Lovely to see my country through your eyes. Thank you, Kartika.
That's nice.
And following up from Juhi Pandey, who's also here at TSA. She's the one that we illustrated in the Neela House in Jaipur. Thanks, Annin. You really summed up the journey that needs to be continued in India. And we certainly all hope that that will be possible at a later date.
I thought Juhi Pandey and Raji Benvankar's presentation here at TSA was exemplary in the way that it included the artist's voice and really amplified the artist's voice. And I think that's really something that many of our panels, and it's been an interesting point to debate, I think, or not to debate, but to discuss, is the historic anonymity of the weaver and how now scholarship needs to do its best to learn from the weaver being the source.
Yelena suggests, how about bringing a drawloom for TSA 2022?
Oh my God.
You want to address that?
Oh, well, I did a little mock-up, with just 20 draw cords, and I had things taped all over my studio trying to figure out how this worked, but it is portable. It's just how, if I could get my brain around it. Yeah. I was so impressed with how many presentations touched on India, and it was, it's like in the air.
And quite a few on the drawloom.
Yeah, I would add, there's nothing like seeing the drawloom in operation by the people who are skilled to work it. It's when we only see skilled people, we don't realize the sophistication, the training that they've had, and their knowledge. There's a drawloom that's still in operation, I know, in Fez in Morocco. I studied and produced actually a video with a team back in 1990 on Abdulkadir Oragli. His son is now the weaver. But I'll make one point. What was absolutely astonishing, Abdulkadir Oragli, a man with 5 children, he could weave uninterrupted with, I think, 7 colors of weft. That's important because we only have 5 fingers and actually 4 that work well for handling the weft, while visitors stopped in and chatted with him for 10 and 15 minutes. He could change the colors of the weft. He could change the metal thread when it needed to go in, and he was also working the structure. And when his son had to serve as an assistant, his son, who now is the weaver, his son didn't have the expertise for pulling correctly always. And so the father, the weaver, never said a word. When it was incorrect, he just looked at his son. His son would release it, re-pull the draw cords. And so we saw that a number of times when the expert draw boy had to go somewhere else. This is a bit of an aside, but it's an example. Morocco's closer to us sometimes than India is, although I would never talk down the opportunity to go to Varanasi, to Cholapur, and see those looms. That was absolutely fantastic.
Don't we have a final slide that Louise, do you?
Oh, that's later, I think.
Yeah, we have about 14 more minutes for
okay.
Q&A, and we have about 20 more questions.
I won't.
And then I will turn to Louise for the last slide and final comments. Thank you, Barbara. Let's see. Carol and Barbara, this is from Nazanin Hedayat Monroe. Do you have any knowledge about whether the use of the Naqsha came to India from Iran or Central Asia, perhaps through Rahul's research? That was one of my entry questions to this trip, and I can't say that it was answered. Rahul's research has turned up much what mine had, but he quoted an earlier author, that Bahuddin Naqshbandi from Bukhara is quoted among the families from Varanasi. But more than that, and I think that came from an earlier article by Pupul Jayakar, and that there's an invocation prayer that goes back. I've often wondered about the connection between the Naqshbandi Sufi order and the use of the Naqsha and the tire of the Naqsha, the Naqshbandi. But no, we did not turn up any additional conclusive evidence or information on that. Barbara, do you want to add anything?
Well, I just think that there was perhaps a connection with Bukhara in particular, because that's where the royal courts were, I don't have any information, but I think I talked to Rahul Jain, who is in the Margalan city in Uzbekistan, and he said, well, everything good comes from Uzbekistan, so he thought maybe there was a connection. And he's an ikat weaver.
Louise, a question to you from James Turner. Was the scent garden, that's the Mehtab Bagh that you mentioned, located at the planned site of the black marble copy of the Taj Mahal that was never built?
Yes.
Yes.
The quick answer is yes.
Yeah, it's right across the Yamuna River from the Taj Mahal, with a beautiful view of it all throughout the day, but especially on moonlit nights. It was Elizabeth Moynihan and an American team working collaboratively that excavated that garden, and the book in which it's published is called, I think, The Moonlit Garden. Somewhere around here I have a copy. If I find it, I'll show it. Let's see, Kathy Judkins. Is there a catalog or pamphlet from the exhibition of Indian textiles and Western designers? And that would be at the Arwin Foundation. If so, what is the title?
The title of the exhibit was Alchemy. And they did publish, not exactly a catalog, but it's been reviewed online. Hindustani Times had a review of that exhibit. So there's at least some immediate reference that way.
Nazanin also asked, this is for Barbara, did you find that the cartoon or the drawing for the Naqsha was very detailed?
Oh, well, the one that Nasim did for us was almost like a cartoon, I mean, it was like the simplest of the simple, but it was really good for me because I could then understand what he was doing. The one I showed right after the Ambi design, the kind of the paisley design, or how you call it, mango. That's more his artistry, and he's known for brocade design. I think the national award was for brocade, and so and his are very fine details in it. But he credited his grandfather as being the real master, the one who had actually the most beautiful, exquisite eye. And the Naqsha man can identify the work. I mean, they look at the cloth and they know who did the Naqsha. And I'm not there. I don't, I'm just trying to figure out the rudiments. But I'm sure that within there, they see the sophistication.
This is for Louise and Anna, I think. This is from Michelle Hopkins. Fascinating presentation, many thanks. My question is about the market viability of creating such labor-intensive velvet and lampas textiles. Who buys them?
Oh, I think Rahul told us that there's a patron behind this enterprise, who's a rich Indian industrialist who acquires these pieces. So they're not for sale. And Rahul very aptly explained to us that these kind of textiles, because they're so hugely expensive to produce, they were never produced commercially. They were always royal gifts. So they're sort of outside of the market. They're not market objects. They are royal gifts, or something to collect. And I think he meant to say that it remains within these kind of circles even today. Louise, do you have something to say to that?
The only thing I'd add is that he's still experimenting at times. The velvet that you saw in the loom was he considered an experiment. There were issues with it that didn't make it as easy to weave. Mm-hmm. And so so that would be another reason. So they're not in it from the point of view of production.
I purchased the second product from his looms for the Textile Museum in the 1990s. And I think that the first and third may have been purchased by the Victorian Albert Museum and the Art Institute in Chicago. Louise, perhaps you can confirm that.
Yeah, Chicago definitely has one. I don't know of other museums, but there may well be more.
But in a way, these acquisitions also, they're a kind of patronage, aren't they? I mean, you're not commercializing these things. They're far too expensive for anybody to use.
I think it's also, we commented as we were traveling, the vast quantity of velvets and lampas and tent linings that remain in India, as opposed to, there's many more that have remained in India than are in Western collections. But it certainly is indicative of royal patronage in the 17th century. Another question from Dale Gluckman. This is to Annin. Are you aware that Ray and Charles Eames were instrumental in the founding of the National Institute of Design? Fabulous trip, thank you all. Many memories of India, friends and colleagues there, and fabulous textiles that came flooding back.
Thank you for that. This is one of the areas I hope to continue researching.
The time that I was in Ahmedabad before this trip, there was actually a celebration of that gathering, and Bob Staples and Barbara Charles, who had been with the Eames studio, and Bob had been working with Charles Eames at the time of the founding, I think, or very early on in the early 60s. And they were talking about the Eames role in the foundation. Let's see, we have about 6 more minutes. So there's a few more questions here. Deepshika Kalsi, Rahul had taken inspiration from that Lampas Kanat panel and exhibited similar Lampas Kanat at his exhibition at the National Museum. as shared in one of the initial slides of the exhibition. Louise, do you want to address that?
I'm not certain what the question is, but it's true. He was inspired by the tall panel that then Anna showed later as an example.
Reweavings of them. They're identical reweavings, and you did show them in your initial slide. Correct.
And also from the National Museum in Delhi, the exhibition.
Correct.
They were there for the 25th celebration of Asha.
I think we've addressed, Michelle, your question, who does Asha sell to? It's mostly by patronage and commission. Has Rahul or anyone produced a video of the drawloom in operation? And related to that, Louise, a question of whether your drawloom video of Fez is available publicly.
Oh, wow. I would hope so, but I'll be honest, I haven't checked that recently. I know it's been upgraded as much as possible while I was still at the Cleveland Museum of Art, so the technology was brought up to date, but it's already 4 years, who knows? I would hope so. It doesn't have a lot on the drawloom, but that's part of it. It's because it's the traditional textile practices in Fez at the time.
I'd like to add about the drawloom. There is something on YouTube on it, but well, I shouldn't critique it. But the thing is, for a weaver, it doesn't show enough, and it doesn't stay long enough, because you don't see a full repeat of any cycle of the operation, and so it's like a glimpse. And so it's like you can identify it like it being a cocker spaniel or a dog and not a cat, but it's not enough to really teach you what's there. I don't have film skills, but maybe this questionnaire has that. That would be wonderful to have actually a real archive of the workings.
There were two comments that I think I've just put up that you can see. Kartika, great idea to have a drawloom at the next GSA Symposium. And Yelena, Rahul brought one to China a few years ago for the Loom Conference and exhibition. So maybe he's the one for us to turn to and ask and see if that's a possibility. I'd like now to turn the floor back to Louise for a final comment. And we thank you all. And please, if there were questions that didn't get answered, feel free to contact any of us through the attendees list and the messaging or directly by email. Thank you. Louise, you're on.
Thank you. Our group would like to extend heartfelt thanks to Rahul Jain and to all the skilled artisans, small business owners, and curators who showed us their specialties, plus our guides, drivers, and so many more. We wish them and their families good health and well-being during this pandemic and in the future. So in conclusion, we thank all of you for joining us.